What would you do if the key to your stolen future was frozen in time, buried in a forgotten wreck that everyone in the world told you was worthless? For 20-year-old Annie Bell Royce, the answer came in the dead of a Wyoming winter, when she paid the last of her father's meager inheritance, $3.50, for a wagon trapped in the ice of the Redemption River. They all laughed, of course. But the truth waiting inside that frozen tomb, a truth that would thaw with the coming of spring, was a testament to the fact that some legacies are not written in gold, but in ink, and on the very land itself. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of quiet courage and of promise kept across generations. Annie Bell Royce arrived in the town of Redemption Creek with little more than the clothes on her back, a worn leather satchel containing her father's surveying tools, and a silence that clung to her like the winter dust. It was a place of ghosts for her, a valley her family had fled in shame 2 decades before she was even born. Her father, a quiet man who spoke more to maps than to people, had died a month prior in a dusty boarding house in Laramie, leaving her with a handful of coins and a whispered, fragmented story of betrayal. He'd spoken of lines on a map, of a promise made to his own father, Jedediah Royce, and of a shadow that had fallen over their name. Annie, now an orphan, had come to Redemption Creek not for vengeance, but for an ending. She needed to see the place that had broken her family, to stand on the ground her father had spoken of with such a strange mix of reverence and sorrow. She carried his tools, the compass, the gunter's chain, the worn tripod of his theodolite, not as instruments of a trade she barely understood, but as holy relics, the last tangible pieces of the man who had been her entire world. The town itself was a hard place, etched into the landscape by wind and desperation. Its buildings were hunched against the relentless Wyoming sky, their clapboard siding bleached to the color of bone. The people were no different, weathered, watchful, and quick to judge. They saw in Annie a reflection of their own hard-won survival, but also an unwelcome specter from the past. The name Royce was not forgotten here. It was a cautionary tale, whispered in the saloon, a story of a man who reached too high and fell too far. Her presence was a stone dropped into a still, cold pond. She found a room for rent above the mercantile, a small, airless space that smelled of kerosene and dried beans. From her single window she could see the spine of the mountains and, snaking through the valley below, the frozen ribbon of the Redemption River. It was there, half submerged in a sheath of milky ice, that she saw it for the first time, the wagon. An old Conestoga, its canvas top shredded by wind and time, its massive wheels locked fast in the river's grip. It had been there since a flash flood the previous winter, a monument to some forgotten traveler's misfortune. It was a town landmark, a joke, a piece of grim scenery. Annie felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a sense of recognition that she couldn't place. It looked lonely, abandoned, much like herself. She learned its story from the mercantile owner, a man with tired eyes and a kind, weary mouth. The owner was unknown, presumed dead or long gone. The wagon and its contents, whatever they might be, were now the property of the county. The sheriff, a man named Gable, who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, had decided to auction it off for scrap before the spring thaw made a mess of it. The auction was a small, mean affair held on the steps of the sheriff's office. A handful of men gathered, their laughter puffing white in the frigid air. The bidding was a joke, $1 for the iron wheel rims, 50 cents for the salvageable planking. It was then that the town's richest and most powerful man, Silas Blackwood, made his appearance. Blackwood was a man built of bluster and entitlement, his wealth as vast and imposing as the ranch he commanded. He laughed the loudest. $1 for the whole frozen mess, he boomed, just to see it hauled away for firewood. The crowd chuckled. Sheriff Gable was about to bang his makeshift gavel when a quiet voice cut through the cold. $3.50. Every head turned. Annie Bell Royce stood at the edge of the small crowd, her face pale but her gaze steady. She held out the coins in her gloved hand. A stunned silence fell, broken only by Blackwood's incredulous snort. "The girl? What in God's name would a slip of a thing like you want with that wreck?" Annie didn't answer him. She just looked at the sheriff, her eyes unwavering. Sheriff Gable, looking uncomfortable, shrugged. "Sold," he muttered, "to Miss Royce, for $3.50. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. It echoed off the false fronts of the buildings as Annie walked away, the bill of sale clutched in her hand. She had just spent her last penny on a ghost, a frozen joke, but as she walked toward the river, she felt not foolishness, but a strange, quiet certainty. She had not just bought a wagon, she had bought a piece of the past, a piece of her own forgotten story. What could possibly be inside that frozen shell worth a young woman's last dollar? Was it a fool's hope, a desperate grasp at a phantom legacy? Or did the ice hold a secret that the whole town had forgotten how to see? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history brought to light. Now, as the first signs of a reluctant spring began to touch the valley, Annie's lonely vigil began. The mockery did not end at the auction. It followed Annie like a shadow, clinging to her in the whispers. At the mercantile, the pointed stares in the street, the open derision of the men who gathered on the porch of the saloon. Silas Blackwood was the conductor of this cruel orchestra. He would ride past the riverbank where Annie had made her meager camp, his fine horse kicking up clods of thawing earth, and call out to her, "Still waiting on your ship to come in, Miss Royce? Looks more like a shipwreck to me." His hired hands would echo his laughter, their voices carrying on the wind, sharp as shards of glass. Annie never responded. She would simply turn her back, her shoulders set in a line of quiet defiance, and continue her work, mending a tear in her thin blanket or tending to the small fire that was her only source of warmth. Her silence seemed to enrage Blackwood more than any retort could have. It was a wall he could not breach, a dignity he could not tarnish. He saw her not as a threat, but as an affront to the natural order of things. A world where he was king and the forgotten were meant to stay forgotten. The townspeople, for their part, were a chorus of doubt. "Poor thing," the women would murmur, touched by grief. "Wasting her time," the men would grumble, "ought to find work as a laundress or a cook." No one offered help. No one offered a kind word. Her loneliness was absolute, a cold, smooth stone in the pit of her stomach. Her only companion was Job, the old sway-backed mule she'd inherited along with her father's tools. Job was as quiet and weathered as she was, his long ears occasionally twitching, as if to catch the town's unkind words and dismiss them. He would stand patiently by the river, his breath plumbing in the air, a silent, steady presence in a world that offered none. One afternoon, as a pale sun fought to break through the gray mantle of clouds, Annie had a visitor. An old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, approached her camp. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her dark eyes holding a depth that seemed to encompass the entire valley. Annie recognized her as one of the few remaining Ute people who lived in the high country, a woman the townspeople called Willow Who Waits. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her moccasins making no sound on the damp ground. She stopped a few feet from Annie's fire and looked not at her, but at the frozen wagon. For a long time she said nothing. The silence was different from the town's. It was full, not empty. It held the weight of seasons, of memories older than the town itself. Finally, she turned her gaze to Annie. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and raspy, like stones rubbing together in a riverbed. "The river keeps what the mountain remembers," she said. Just that. She held Annie's gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, then turned and walked away as silently as she had come. Annie was left staring after her, the cryptic words hanging in the cold air. The river keeps what the mountain remembers. It made no sense. The mountains were stone and snow. The river was ice and water. What could they remember, and what did it have to do with her? With this broken-down wagon? The words were a puzzle, a key without a lock. She tucked them away in her mind, another piece of the mystery she had bought for $3.50. The encounter left her feeling unsettled, but also strangely fortified. It was the first time someone had looked at her without pity or scorn. The old woman's words felt less like a warning and more like a benediction, a hint that there were forces at work in this valley far older and more powerful than the cruel laughter of men like Silas Blackwood. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of lavender and rose, Annie looked at the wagon, its dark shape stark against the ice. She didn't understand the old woman's words, but she felt their truth in her bones. The wagon was more than wood and iron. It was a vessel of memory, and the river, in its frozen grip, was not its destroyer. It was its keeper. The journey to the wagon was a short one in distance, but a long one in spirit. Each morning, Annie would leave her small room and walk the half-mile to the river's edge, her father's mule, Job, trudging faithfully behind her. She had built a small, crude shelter against a stand of hardy cottonwoods, a simple lean-to of scavenged planks and a tarp, barely enough to break the wind. It was here she spent her days, a solitary figure in a vast, indifferent landscape. The world was rendered in shades of gray and white. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of cloud. The wind was a constant, mournful cry that swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The initial sense of hope she had felt after buying the wagon began to fray at the edges, worn thin by the cold and the solitude. Up close, the wagon looked even more hopeless. The ice was thick, a solid, opaque mass that encased the lower half of the great wheels and climbed the sides of the wagon bed. The canvas cover was in tatters, flapping dismally in the wind like a surrendered flag. The wood of the wagon box was splintered and waterlogged, stained dark by its long immersion. It seemed impossible that anything of value could have survived. Disappointment settled in her chest, heavy and cold as the river ice. The townspeople were right. Blackwood was right. She had bought a ruin, a monument to her own foolish desperation. She had traded her last dollars for a pile of frozen firewood. For the first few days, she did nothing but watch. She sat on a fallen log, wrapped in her thin blanket, and simply stared at the wagon, letting the full weight of her decision settle upon her. She listened. She listened to the groaning of the ice, the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods, the rhythmic crunch of Job chewing his meager ration of hay. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. At night, she would sleep fitfully in her lean-to, the cold seeping into her bones. The fire would burn down to a bed of glowing embers, and the darkness would press in, vast and absolute. In those long, silent hours, the ghosts of her past felt very near. She remembered her father's hands, stained with ink and dirt, tracing lines on a map. She remembered the sadness in his eyes, a deep, abiding sorrow she had never understood. He had tried to tell her something in his final days, his voice a weak rasp. The lines, Annie, the lines are true. Don't let them forget the lines, she had thought it, the rambling of a dying man. Now, alone in the Wyoming wilderness, his words echoed in her mind with a new and troubling significance. She began to feel a strange kinship with the wagon. It was an outcast, just like her. It was dismissed, just like her. It held a story that no one cared to hear, just like her. She would talk to it sometimes, her voice a low murmur that was quickly snatched away by the wind. "What are you hiding?" she'd ask. "What did you carry?" The wagon, of course, offered no reply. But as the days bled into one another, a subtle shift occurred. Her vigil became less about waiting and more about observing. She started to notice the small details, the specific way the ice had formed, thicker on the upstream side, the craftsmanship of the iron fittings on the wheels, elegant even in their rust, the faint, almost invisible, traces of blue paint on a single board of the wagon box, a small touch of vanity on an otherwise utilitarian object. She was no longer just looking at a wreck. She was studying a relic. The initial disappointment began to recede, replaced by a quiet, stubborn curiosity. She had made her choice. She had staked her entire future, however small, on this frozen hulk. She would not walk away now. She would see it through to the end, to the thaw. One evening, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, for the first time in a week, its golden light spilled across the valley, setting the ice aglow. The wagon was transformed. It was no longer a dark, dismal shape, but a thing of strange beauty, encased in a tomb of amber and gold. In that moment, Annie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a fragile thing, as fleeting as the winter light, but it was there. The wagon was not dead. It was waiting, and so was she. A week passed, then another. The days grew infinitesimally longer, the sun a little stronger. The relentless grip of winter began to loosen. The surface of the river ice, once a solid sheet, now showed a network of fine, spidery cracks. The sound of the valley changed. The mournful howl of the wind was joined by a new music. The gentle drip of melting snow from the branches, the gurgle of water moving beneath the ice, the occasional sharp crack as the river began to stretch and awaken. Annie's vigil became more active. She spent her days pacing the riverbank, studying the wagon from every angle, her eyes scanning for any change. And then she saw it. A piece of the heavy canvas that had once formed the wagon's roof, a section that had been trapped and preserved by the ice, had finally been released by the slow melt. It sagged downwards, heavy with water, and a corner of it tore loose, dangling precariously. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone else. But to Annie, who had spent weeks memorizing every line and shadow of the wreck, it was a major event. She waded into the frigid ankle-deep water at the river's edge, her boots sinking into the muddy bottom. Her hands, numb with cold, reached for the torn piece of canvas. The material was thick and stiff, woven with a tightness she had never seen before. It was not ordinary sailcloth. As she examined the frayed edge, her fingers brushed against something hard and small, sewn into the hem. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thump. With trembling fingers she worked at the thick waxed threads. They were stubborn, refusing to yield. She took out her father's small pocket knife, its blade worn smooth with use, and carefully, painstakingly cut the stitches. A small object fell from the canvas into her palm. It was an oilskin pouch, no bigger than her thumb, tied shut with a leather thong. It was dry. The thick, oiled fabric had protected its contents completely from the water. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with cold and anticipation. Finally it came loose. She tipped the pouch and something fell into her hand, heavy and cool against her skin. It was a key. It was an unusual key, wrought from dark, heavy iron, its shaft intricately turned. The bow was solid, and the bit was a complex shape, designed for a lock of some substance. Attached to the bow by a small brass ring was a metal tag. It was tarnished with age, but she could still make out the markings stamped into its surface. There was a number, 27, and below it, a stylized letter R, enclosed in a simple, elegant circle, an R. For Royce or for redemption, she didn't know. She had never seen a key like it. It was too ornate for a simple padlock, too substantial for a door. It was a key to something important, something meant to be kept safe. She closed her hand around it, the cold metal warming against her skin. It was the first tangible thing the wagon had given her, the first clue. It was a promise. The disappointment that had weighed her down for weeks began to lift, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a fierce, protective resolve. The townspeople could laugh, Blackwood could mock, but they didn't know. They saw a wreck. She held a key. It was a small detail, a thing that refused to fit the narrative of a worthless, forgotten piece of junk. It was a question, an invitation, and as she stood there in the freezing water, The key clutched in her hand, Annie Bell Royce knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was on the right path. The river was beginning to give up its secrets. The thaw, once it began in earnest, was a force of nature. The gentle drips and trickles became a roar. The ice on the Redemption River, weakened from beneath by the quickening current, and from above by the strengthening sun, began to break apart with reports like cannon fire. Great sheets of it, tons in weight, fractured and heaved, grinding against each other as the liberated river pushed them downstream. The wagon was no longer encased, it was under siege. Annie watched with a mixture of terror and excitement. The immense power of the moving ice threatened to tear the wagon apart, to smash it to splinters before it could reveal its secrets. But the old Conestoga was built to last. Its thick oak frame and iron-braced wheels, locked in the muddy riverbed, held fast against the assault. Annie knew she had to act quickly. Once the main ice flow passed, the rising water and strong current could still wrench the wagon free and carry it. Away, she had to get it to the bank. It was a task that seemed impossible for one young woman and an old mule. But desperation is a powerful fuel. She retrieved the gunter's chain from her father's satchel. It was a surveyor's chain, 66 feet of iron links designed for measuring, not hauling. It was all she had. She waded into the churning, debris-filled water, the cold, a brutal shock that stole her breath. She managed to loop the chain around the wagon's front axle, her hands raw and bleeding from the sharp edges of the broken ice. She secured the other end to the strongest cottonwood on the bank. It was a fragile tether, but it was something. For the next 3 days, she and Job labored. It was a grueling, heartbreaking ballet of muscle and will. Annie used a long, sturdy log as a pry bar, jamming it under the wheels, trying to break the suction of the mud. Job, harnessed with ropes, pulled with a strength that belied his age, his old muscles straining, his hooves digging into the soft earth. They would gain an inch, only to have the river pull it back. The work was relentless. Annie's hands were a mess of blisters and cuts. Her muscles screamed in protest. She ate little, slept less. She was fueled by a single-minded obsession, a fire that burned away her exhaustion and her fear. During this intense physical labor, another clue emerged. As she worked to clear mud and debris from the wagon bed, her hand brushed against the underside of the driver's seat. She felt something rough. Wiping away the slime, she saw it. Letters crudely carved into the wood, R-O-Y-C-E, her own name. A jolt went through her, electric and fierce. This wasn't just any wagon. This was their wagon, her family's wagon. The one her father had spoken of in his fevered last days. The one they had been forced to abandon when they fled this valley. The knowledge transformed her labor. It was no longer a salvage operation. It was a rescue. She was not just pulling a piece of property from the river. She was reclaiming a piece of her own history, a piece of her father. The connection she felt was no longer just imagined. It was real, carved in wood. With renewed determination, she devised a new plan. Using her father's block and tackle, which she found wrapped in oilcloth in his satchel, she created a rudimentary pulley system. It multiplied their strength. Slowly, painfully, inch by agonizing inch, the wagon began to move. It scraped and groaned, fighting the river's pull. The sound was terrible, the screech of wood and iron that had been silent for a year. Finally, with one last, desperate heave from Job and a final, agonizing push from Annie, the front wheels broke free of the water's edge and rolled onto the muddy bank. The wagon was free. It stood there, dripping and broken, listing to one side like a wounded beast. It was a wreck. The siding was splintered, one wheel was shattered, the tongue was snapped. But it was whole, and it was hers. She sank to her knees in the mud, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion and triumph. Job came and stood beside her, nudging her shoulder with his soft nose. Annie leaned against him, burying her face in his coarse mane, and for the first time since her father's death she wept. They were not tears of sorrow, but of release, of a profound and deeply felt connection to the past she had come here to find. She had done it. She had pulled her family's history from the frozen water. The wagon sat on the riverbank, a wounded survivor drying in the spring sun. It smelled of river mud, wet wood, and a deeper, older scent of time itself. For a full day, Annie did nothing but rest, allowing her aching body to recover. But her mind was racing, the key, the carved name. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming the edges of a picture she couldn't yet fully see. The key, heavy and solid in her pocket, was a constant reminder. What did it open? She searched the wagon's exterior, running her hands over every inch of the weathered wood, looking for a lock, a hidden panel, anything. She found nothing. The main wagon box was empty, scoured clean by the floodwaters. The built-in tool chests and storage compartments were either broken open or held nothing but silt and river stones. Frustration began to gnaw at her. Had she come all this way, fought so hard, for nothing more than a name and a useless key? She refused to believe it. Her father had been a surveyor, a man of precision and detail. If he had hidden something in this wagon, it would be well hidden. She remembered his workshop, the way he would build secret drawers into his own desk, puzzles of wood and ingenuity. She climbed into the wagon bed. The floor was made of thick oak planks, warped and swollen from their time in the water. She began to tap them, one by one, listening to the sound. Most gave a dull, solid thud. But then, near the front of the wagon, under the spot where the driver's seat was mounted, one plank sounded different. Hollow, her heart leaped. She used the pry bar from her tool roll, wedging its tip into the narrow gap between the boards. The wood was stubborn. It took all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest. But finally, with a groan of tortured nails, the plank lifted, and there it was. A compartment. It was not large, but it was expertly concealed, a false bottom built into the very structure of the wagon. And set into the top of a dark, heavy box that filled the space was a lock. It was an intricate, brass-faced thing, tarnished green with age, and the keyhole matched the strange, complex shape of the key she had found in the canvas. With a hand that trembled, she took the key from her pocket. The brass tag with its R and the number 27 glinted in the sunlight. She slid the key into the lock. It was a perfect fit. She turned it. There was a moment of resistance, then a series of satisfying, solid clicks as the tumblers aligned. The lock was open. She lifted the lid of the compartment. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried oilcloth, was a heavy iron strongbox, bound with straps of the same metal. It was not locked with a key, but with a simple, heavy latch. She lifted the latch and raised the lid. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, leather, and ink. Her breath caught in her throat. The box was full. On top lay a set of leather-bound field journals, their pages filled with her father's neat, precise script. Beneath them were rolled bundles of vellum, maps, dozens of them, meticulously drawn and annotated. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a protective oilskin sheath, was a single, folded document, a deed. She carefully lifted the deed and unfolded it. The paper was thick, the ink faded but still legible. It was a land grant from the territorial government, dated 1863, 20 years prior. It granted title of a vast tract of the Redemption Valley, 10,000 acres, to one Jedediah Royce, her grandfather. Her hands shaking, she unrolled the first map. It was a survey map of the valley, and the boundaries it showed matched the deed exactly. She unrolled another, and another. They were her father's work, detailed surveys of the same land, cross-referenced with his journals. She opened one of the journals. The early entries were filled with hope, descriptions of the rich soil, the abundant water. Then the tone began to change. An entry from 1864 mentioned a new arrival in the valley. A man named Silas Blackwood, who had started a small cattle operation on the edge of the Royce claim. A year later, the entries became darker. Blackwood's herd encroaches again. He disputes the markers. He calls my survey fraudulent. Then, a chilling entry from the fall of 1865. Confronted Blackwood today. He laughed in my face. Told me the valley belongs to the man strong enough to hold it. His eyes, there is a coldness there, a man without a soul. The last entry, dated just days later, was short and frantic. An accident at the South Ridge. Father is gone. Blackwood's men were there. They say he fell. I know better. We have to leave. I've hidden the box. The lines are true. The lines are true. The truth hit Annie with the force of a physical blow. Silas Blackwood, the richest man in the valley, the man who had mocked her, who had built his empire on this land, was a thief and a murderer. He hadn't bought this land. He hadn't earned it. He had stolen it, piece by piece, after orchestrating her grandfather's death and driving her father away. This strongbox didn't just contain paper and ink. It contained justice. It was the mountain's memory, and the river had kept it safe for her. The weight of the discovery was immense. It was a truth so large it seemed to alter the very air she breathed. For a day she did nothing, simply sitting with the strongbox, reading her father's words, tracing the lines on his maps. The grief for the grandfather she never knew, and the father she had lost, was a raw, open wound. But beneath the grief, a new feeling was taking root, a cold, hard resolve. She had to do something. But what? Blackwood owned this town. He owned the sheriff. He owned the fear in men's hearts. Who would believe her? A penniless orphan with a box of old papers. As if summoned by her thoughts, a new threat appeared on the horizon. A change in the weather. The promising spring sky had vanished, replaced by a low, bruised-looking ceiling of cloud moving in fast from the north. The wind picked up, carrying the biting chill of a late-season blizzard. The old timbers in town had warned of them. Freak storms that could dump feet of snow in a matter of hours, a final, brutal gasp of winter. Annie knew she was dangerously exposed. Her lean-to was no match for a real storm. She had to secure the strongbox and find shelter. As she frantically began packing the journals and maps back into the box, she heard a sound over the rising wind, the desperate shout of a man's voice. Peering through the swirling snow, she saw them, a family of homesteaders, their wagon hopelessly mired in the mud a quarter-mile downriver. One of its wheels had shattered, just like her own wagon's had. A man, a woman, and two small children were huddled together, their faces etched with panic as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. Her first instinct was self-preservation. She had to protect the box. It was the only thing that mattered. But then she looked at the children, their small forms shivering in the wind, and she saw herself, alone, frightened, at the mercy of forces far beyond her control. In that moment, a choice was made. She hefted the heavy strongbox, carried it to the relative safety of the broken Conestoga, and wedged it deep inside the wreckage. Then, without a second thought, she grabbed her ropes and ran toward the stranded family. The man, whose name was Thomas, looked at her with disbelief. "Our axles snapped clean," he cried over the wind. "We're done for." "No, you're not," Annie said, her voice firm. "We'll use my wagon." The storm hit with full fury. The wind became a physical wall, driving snow so thick it blotted out the world. Working together, they managed to unhitch the family's oxen and lead them, along with Job, to the shelter of the cottonwood grove. Annie then led the family to her camp. The lean-to was pathetic, but the old Conestoga was a fortress. She helped Thomas and his wife, Sarah, push and drag the massive wreck until it was positioned as a windbreak, its solid oak side facing the brunt of the blizzard. Behind it, in the small pocket of relative calm, she built up the fire. She shared her meager food supplies, hardtack and dried meat, and her blankets. The small family huddled close to the flames, their eyes wide with fear and gratitude. Throughout the long, terrifying night, as the blizzard raged around them, Annie stood guard. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying her camp, burying the world. At one point, through a lull in the wind, she thought she heard the sound of horses and men shouting, their voices quickly swallowed by the storm. She peered into the white chaos, her hand resting on the pry bar. She suspected it was Blackwood, drawn by rumors or a guilty conscience, coming to investigate her find. But the storm was her shield. It had trapped them all, but it had also protected her. Huddled in the lee of the broken wagon, sharing warmth with strangers, Annie felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer just the keeper of her family's grievance. She was a protector. She had chosen to shelter life over hoarding evidence. This act of communion, of shared vulnerability in the face of the storm, solidified her resolve in a way that the discovery alone never could have. She was fighting not just for a piece of land, but for a principle, that you don't abandon people in a storm. You use what you have, even if it's just a wreck, to offer shelter. The wagon had saved them. This discarded, mocked, broken thing had become their salvation. The crisis had tested her, and she had not been found wanting. She would see this through, not just for her father, but for them, for anyone who had ever been left out in the cold. When the world returned, it was a place transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape of impossible, silent beauty. The sun shone from a brilliant blue sky, and the valley was buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. The air was clean and cold. The fire still flickered in the shelter of the wagon, and the homesteader family was safe. Thomas and Sarah looked at Annie with a reverence that went beyond simple gratitude. "You saved us," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our children." Annie simply nodded, her face smudged with soot, her eyes tired but clear. As the sun climbed higher, melting the top layer of snow, the town began to stir. A rescue party, led by Sheriff Gable, rode out from Redemption Creek, expecting to find bodies. Instead, they found a small, functioning camp and a family alive and well. The story spread through the valley like wildfire. It was told by Thomas and Sarah when they reached the safety of the town. It was a simple story, but a powerful one. The strange girl who bought the frozen wagon had used it to save a family from the blizzard. The narrative of Annie Bell Royce began to change. The whispers of poor, touched thing were replaced with murmurs of courage and kindness. The laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. Even Silas Blackwood, when he heard the news, was said to have fallen silent, his usual bluster deserting him. The goodwill gave Annie the opening she needed. She knew she couldn't win this fight in Redemption Creek, where Blackwood's influence was absolute. She needed an authority he couldn't corrupt. Leaving the mended wagon in Thomas's care, she packed the strongbox, saddled Job, and began the long journey to Cheyenne, the territorial capital. She arrived 3 days later, dusty and exhausted. She found the office of the county clerk and recorder, a quiet, orderly place that smelled of paper and sealing wax. The clerk himself, a man named Elias Thorne, was a mild-mannered man with spectacles and a meticulous nature. He listened patiently to her story, his expression unreadable. He asked few questions, simply nodding as she laid out the tale of the wagon, the key, and the strongbox. When she had finished, she opened the box on his desk. She laid out the deed first, then her grandfather's survey, and finally, her father's journals and corroborating maps. Thorne picked up the original deed, holding it to the light, examining the paper, the ink, the official seal. He spent the better part of an hour poring over the documents. He cross-referenced the surveys with the official territorial maps hanging on his wall. He read passages from her father's journals, his brow furrowed in concentration. The silence in the office was thick with tension. Annie sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her entire future hanging on this quiet man's judgment. Finally, Thorne removed his spectacles and polished them with the soft cloth. He looked at Annie, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, gentle, profound respect. "Miss Royce," he said, his voice calm and even. "These documents are authentic. The original survey by your grandfather, Jedediah Royce. is properly filed and recorded with the territorial government. Your father's subsequent work only confirms its accuracy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "According to these records, which are the supreme legal authority in this matter, title to the 10,000 acres currently known as the Blackwood Ranch is, and has always been, held by the Royce family." He looked directly at her. "The land is yours." The words were simple, delivered without drama, but they landed with the force of a tectonic shift. It was real. It was true. Vindication. It wasn't a feeling of triumph or a desire for revenge. It was a quiet, deep, and overwhelming sense of peace. The truth, buried for 20 years, had finally come to light. The chorus of mocking laughter from the town had faded, replaced by the quiet, authoritative voice of the law. Blackwood had been exposed not by a gunfight, but by a piece of paper, not by violence, but by the quiet, meticulous work of a man who believed in the truth of lines drawn on a map. The news traveled back to Redemption Creek faster than Annie did. When she returned, riding Job into the valley, she was no longer an outcast. The townspeople looked at her differently. They saw not a foolish girl, but the rightful heir to the valley itself. Outsiders began to arrive, lawyers from Cheyenne, agents from the land office, journalists drawn by the incredible story. Silas Blackwood was a broken man. He was not arrested. The accident of her grandfather's death was too old, the evidence too circumstantial for a murder charge. But his empire, built on a lie, crumbled. He was forced by federal marshals to cede the land, to remove his herds, to dismantle the sprawling ranch house that had been a monument to his stolen wealth. He did not fight. The evidence was too absolute. The last Annie saw of him, he was riding out of the valley on a tired horse, his face gray and haggard, a man hollowed out by his own greed. He was humbled without being publicly humiliated, a fate that felt more just than any jail cell. The townspeople, who had once been his cronies and admirers, simply watched him go in silence. Their allegiance, always a thing of convenience, had shifted. Annie did not move into Blackwood's opulent house. She had it dismantled, its timber and stone given to the homesteader family, the Thomases, and others who were starting out in the valley. She did not set herself up as a cattle baroness. Instead, she began the slow, quiet work of stewardship. She walked the land, her father's maps in hand, learning its contours, its secrets, its needs. The final scene of her long struggle played out at golden hour, on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fire and amber. The land below her land was bathed in a warm, gentle light. Job stood beside her, his quiet presence a comfort. She held not a deed or a map, but a single smooth stone she had picked up from the riverbank. She was not Annie Bell Royce, the heiress. She was not the victor in a long-fought battle. She was just a woman standing on the ground her family had loved, a keeper of a promise she hadn't known she was making. She thought of her father, of his quiet obsession with his surveying tools, his endless drawing of lines that no one else seemed to value. She finally understood. He wasn't just measuring acres or marking boundaries. He was codifying a truth, preserving a legacy in the only way he knew how. He was entrusting the future to the integrity of his work. Looking out over the vast expanse of the Redemption Valley, the land now peaceful and whole, she murmured the words, aloud to the wind, a quiet epitaph for her father and grandfather. They thought he just drew lines on paper, she said softly. But he was drawing a promise. It was not about ownership, it was about truth. And the truth, she now knew, had a weight and a permanence that could outlast any fortune, outlive any lie, and even survive being frozen in a river for 20 years. The land was finally at peace, and so was she. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey. This has been a story about the enduring power of quiet conviction, a reminder that what the world dismisses often holds the very thing we need most. If you were moved by Annie's story, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. and subscribe to our channel for more tales of history's hidden heroes. We'll be back soon with the story of a lone prospector who found something far more valuable than gold in the heart of an abandoned mine. Until then, take care.